That day was a nightmare I'll never forget. The way she looked at me across that conference room, with that cold smile I'd never seen before, and said those words that cut deeper than any knife ever could. "She's our museum piece." Sweet, but not exactly cutting edge, you know? The laughter that followed from people I'd worked with for years, people I'd helped, people I thought were friends. That laughter is still ringing in my ears. Hailey was someone I'd brought into this company, someone I'd trained from day one when she didn't know a soul in the building. I opened every door for her, taught her everything she knew, defended her when others doubted her abilities. And there she was, 18 months later, systematically destroying my reputation in front of senior management like I was some obsolete piece of office equipment that needed to be discarded. In that moment, my hands started shaking, and I felt this overwhelming urge to just disappear, to sink through the floor and never face any of them again. The humiliation was suffocating. 23 years of dedication, of loyalty, of building relationships and delivering results. All of it reduced to a punchline delivered by someone who owed her entire career to my guidance. I felt betrayed, foolish, and completely alone in a room full of people who were supposed to be my colleagues. But what came after that meeting, what I discovered about who she really was and how far she was willing to go to erase me from her success story, that was even worse than I could have imagined. She didn't know a soul in the company, just another resume among hundreds. But I saw something in her, and I decided to take a chance. I recommended her, trained her, defended her, and I was forgotten the moment she climbed one step higher. I remember that Tuesday morning when she first walked into our office building on 5th Street, clutching her purse like it held all her hopes and dreams. The receptionist pointed her toward the elevator, but she looked so lost, so overwhelmed by the corporate maze we all navigate daily. When she knocked on my cubicle wall, her voice was barely above a whisper asking if I was Rebecca, the one who could help her find her way around. I looked up from my computer screen, saw those nervous eyes, and something in me just clicked. Maybe it was the way she reminded me of myself 20 years ago, or maybe it was just basic human decency. But I pushed back from my desk and said, "Come on, let me show you where the coffee machine is first." That simple gesture would become the foundation of what I thought was genuine gratitude, but what turned out to be calculated opportunism. Those first few weeks I became her unofficial guide through the labyrinth of office politics and procedures. I'd stay late explaining the client management system, walk her through the filing protocols that nobody bothered to write down, and introduce her to key people in every department. During lunch breaks at the little diner across the street, she'd lean forward with wide eyes and say things like, "I honestly don't know how I'd survive here without you showing me the ropes." Her appreciation seemed so genuine, so heartfelt, that I found myself going out of my way to make her transition smoother. I'd forward her important emails, give her heads up about upcoming projects, and even covered for her when she made those inevitable rookie mistakes that could have gotten her in trouble with management. The trust I placed in her felt natural, like mentoring a younger sister who was eager to learn and grateful for guidance. The transformation happened so gradually that I almost missed it entirely. One day she was asking me how to handle difficult clients. The next she was offering unsolicited advice to newer employees about office efficiency. I started noticing how she'd position herself strategically during team meetings, always managing to catch the boss's attention with insights that sounded suspiciously familiar to our private conversations. When I'd mention a project idea during our coffee breaks, somehow that same concept would emerge from her lips during the next department briefing, presented with the confidence of original thinking. The word mentor that she used to say with such reverence slowly disappeared from her vocabulary, replaced by casual references to how she'd figured things out pretty quickly around here. But I told myself I was being paranoid, that success changes people, and maybe she was just finding her own voice in the professional environment. The first real sting came during a client presentation that I'd helped her prepare for weeks. We'd spent countless evenings going over every detail, anticipating questions, refining her delivery until it was flawless. I watched from the back of the conference room, as she commanded attention with poise and expertise that I'd helped cultivate. When the client complimented her thorough understanding of their needs, she smiled graciously and said, "I've always believed in doing my homework and really diving deep into what clients want." No mention of the late nights we'd spent together. No acknowledgement of the crash course in client psychology I'd given her. Just a smooth acceptance of praise for work that was as much mine as hers. The frustration I felt wasn't about wanting credit. It was about feeling invisible, like my contribution had been erased from the story of her success. By the end of her first year, she'd somehow positioned herself as the department's rising star, while I remained in the same cubicle, handling the same routine tasks I've been doing for years. The leadership team began seeking her input on strategic decisions, inviting her to meetings where my years of experience might have been valuable. I'd watch her walk past my desk in her new business suits, briefcase in hand, heading to conferences and client dinners that used to be routine parts of my job. The professional confidence I'd helped build in her had evolved into something that no longer needed or acknowledged its foundation. She'd transformed from a nervous newcomer into a polished professional. But somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten that her success story had a co-author who'd never asked for a byline, just basic recognition of the role I'd played. What hurt most wasn't her success. It was the way she began to treat our shared history like an embarrassing secret. When newer employees would ask her for advice, she'd speak about learning through trial and error and finding your own path, as if she'd navigated those early challenges completely alone. During team-building events, she'd share stories about overcoming obstacles and building client relationships, carefully editing out any reference to the guidance and support that had made those victories possible. The loyalty I'd shown her had somehow become a liability in her narrative, a reminder of weakness rather than a testament to the power of mentorship and professional solidarity. And slowly, painfully, I began to realize that the person I'd invested so much time and energy in had never really seen me as a mentor or colleague, but as a stepping stone to be discarded once she'd reached higher ground. It wasn't a harsh joke. It was a subtle jab disguised as playful banter. She knew exactly where to hit, and she made sure to deliver it in front of everyone. The break room was packed that Friday afternoon, everyone grabbing coffee before the weekly department meeting, when Hailey decided to make her first public move against my dignity. We were discussing the new software update that had everyone frustrated, trying to figure out the revised interface that seemed to change every feature we'd grown comfortable with over the years. I mentioned that I'd found a workaround for the scheduling function, something I'd discovered through trial and error during my lunch break, when she turned to me with that sweet smile that I was beginning to recognize as weaponized kindness. "Oh, Rebecca," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's so cute how you still remember the old ways of doing things. Back in your day, everything was probably so much simpler, right?" The room went quiet for a split second before nervous laughter filled the silence, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The phrase itself wasn't particularly cruel, but the way she delivered it carried layers of condescension that everyone seemed to understand except me in that moment. "Back in your day" became a loaded gun pointed directly at my relevance, my value, my right to contribute meaningfully to conversations about workplace efficiency. She said it with the kind of mock affection that adults use when talking to children who've said something adorable but ultimately meaningless. And the effect was immediate and devastating. The younger employees exchanged glances that spoke volumes about how they viewed my place in the hierarchy, while the older ones suddenly found their coffee cups incredibly interesting, unwilling to align themselves with someone who'd just been publicly diminished. The betrayal wasn't just Hailey's calculated cruelty. It was the room's collective acceptance of my humiliation as entertainment. What made it worse was how she followed up with false concern, tilting her head with exaggerated sympathy as she said, "I mean, you've seen so many changes in technology over the years. It must be overwhelming trying to keep up with everything." The implication was clear to everyone listening, that my experience was actually a disadvantage, that my institutional knowledge was obsolete baggage rather than valuable insight. She positioned herself as the patient teacher explaining modern concepts to someone who'd clearly outlived their usefulness. And the room seemed to buy into her narrative completely. I tried to laugh along, to show that I could take a joke, but the sound that came out of my throat felt hollow and forced, like I was participating in my own professional execution with a smile on my face. The silence that followed was the most revealing part of the entire exchange, because it showed me exactly where I stood with people I'd considered colleagues and friends for years. Nobody came to my defense. Nobody pointed out that my suggestion had actually solved the problem we were all struggling with. Nobody challenged the ageist assumption that experience equals incompetence. Instead, they seemed relieved that someone else had become the target of workplace hierarchy, that the uncomfortable reality of aging in a youth-obsessed industry had been acknowledged and dismissed in one efficient moment. I looked around the room, searching for an ally, a defender, even just a sympathetic glance, but found only averted eyes and uncomfortable fidgeting as people prepared to move on from my public diminishment. Later that day, when I tried to process what had happened, I realized that Hailey had chosen that moment carefully, striking when the audience was largest and my vulnerability most apparent. The coffee break before a department meeting was prime time for social dynamics, when casual conversation could shift workplace perception and establish new pecking orders with surgical precision. She'd identified my age as my greatest liability and weaponized it with the kind of strategic thinking that I'd actually taught her during those early mentoring sessions, using my own guidance to craft the perfect professional assassination. The frustration I felt wasn't just about being insulted. It was about watching someone I nurtured use my own tools against me with ruthless efficiency. The aftermath was almost worse than the initial attack because it established a new normal where my age became fair game for public commentary. Other employees began making similar references, testing the waters to see if they could get the same easy laughs that Hailey had earned with her casual cruelty. During presentations, I'd noticed people glancing at each other when I mentioned previous projects, as if my historical perspective was automatically suspect rather than potentially valuable. The professional environment I'd navigated successfully for decades suddenly felt hostile and unwelcoming, filled with landmines that could explode at any moment, triggered by references to my experience or suggestions that might be perceived as outdated. That night, I went home and stared at myself in the bathroom mirror, trying to see what everyone else apparently saw so clearly. The reflection looking back at me was the same face I'd been wearing for years, maybe a few more lines around the eyes, some grey creeping into my hair, but still capable, still intelligent, still valuable in ways that had nothing to do with my birth year. But Hailey had managed to reframe my appearance as evidence of irrelevance, and now every interaction at work would be filtered through that lens of diminished expectations and casual dismissal. The trust I'd placed in her professional development had been repaid with a systematic campaign to undermine my professional standing, and I was beginning to understand that this was just the opening shot in a much larger war for workplace supremacy. Suddenly, every meeting turned into an opportunity for subtle digs, and everyone laughed like I was some kind of comedy character. It was humiliating, and nobody saw a problem with it. The Monday morning strategy session 3 weeks later was when I realized that Hailey's casual ageism had evolved into systematic psychological warfare disguised as workplace humor. We were reviewing quarterly projections when our manager, Dylan, asked for input on updating our client outreach methods to include more social media integration. I raised my hand and mentioned that we should be careful not to abandon traditional communication channels entirely, since many of our long-term clients still preferred phone calls and email correspondence over Instagram messages and TikTok campaigns. Before I could finish explaining my reasoning, Hailey jumped in with that same saccharine smile and said, "Oh, Rebecca, that's such a sweet old-school perspective, but we really need to think about where the market is heading, not where it's been." The room erupted in polite laughter, and I felt my face burn with embarrassment as my valid business insight was dismissed as nostalgic rambling from someone too set in her ways to understand modern commerce. The phrase that became her signature weapon against my credibility was delivered with theatrical flair that suggested she'd been practicing it in front of her bathroom mirror. Ask Rebecca. She lived through the entire 80s here. Became her go-to response whenever anyone mentioned company history, previous successful campaigns, or institutional knowledge that might actually be relevant to current projects. She'd say it with exaggerated enthusiasm, like she was introducing a living museum exhibit, rather than acknowledging a colleague's professional experience, and the effect was devastating every single time. The younger employees would snicker appreciatively, grateful for someone who could articulate their generational superiority with such eloquent cruelty, while the older staff members would shift uncomfortably in their chairs, probably wondering if they were next on Hailey's hit list. My decades of experience, my institutional memory, my understanding of client relationships that had been built over years of careful cultivation, all of it became fodder for cheap laughs and easy dismissal. What made the routine particularly insidious was how Hailey would follow up her public humiliation with private concern, cornering me after meetings to ask if I was feeling okay, or if the pressure of keeping up with all these changes was getting to me. She'd tilt her head with fake empathy and suggest that maybe I should consider taking it a little easier, implying that my age made me inherently fragile and unsuitable for the demands of modern business. These conversations felt like twisted therapy sessions where the therapist was actively trying to convince me that I was mentally unstable. And the gaslighting was so expertly delivered that I sometimes found myself questioning my own perceptions and wondering if maybe she was right about my declining capabilities. The manipulation was masterful because it positioned her as a caring colleague, looking out for my well-being while simultaneously undermining my confidence and professional standing. The moment I knew things had crossed a line from casual disrespect into active hostility happened during a client presentation where I was supposed to be leading the discussion about long-term relationship management. I'd prepared thoroughly, researching the client's history with our company, their previous projects, their communication preferences, and their business goals for the upcoming quarter. But when I began explaining how our past successes with similar clients could inform our current strategy, Hailey interrupted with a stage whisper that carried clearly across the conference room. Should we maybe get someone to translate this into current business language? The client looked confused, my manager shifted uncomfortably, and I felt something inside me crack like old ice under pressure. The betrayal wasn't just professional anymore. It was personal, calculated, and designed to destroy my credibility in front of the people who determined my career trajectory. The worst part wasn't Hailey's systematic campaign against my dignity. It was watching my colleagues become complicit in my professional execution through their silence and nervous laughter. People I'd worked with for years, shared coffee breaks with, celebrated birthdays with, suddenly acted like my public humiliation was an acceptable form of office entertainment rather than workplace bullying that should have been addressed immediately. During the monthly team building lunch at the diner across the street, I'd catch fragments of conversation about generational differences and adapting to change that seemed specifically designed for my ears. Subtle reminders that I was being discussed and evaluated based on my age rather than my performance. The environment that had once felt collaborative and supportive had transformed into something hostile and predatory, where my experience was treated as a liability and my perspective was dismissed as irrelevant nostalgia. By the end of that month, I developed a Pavlovian response to Hailey's laughter. My stomach would clench and my shoulders would tense whenever I heard that particular sound echoing across the office space. It wasn't just the anticipation of another public embarrassment. It was the knowledge that my professional reputation was being systematically dismantled by someone I'd trusted and nurtured, using tactics that were so subtle and socially acceptable that calling them out would make me look paranoid or overly sensitive. The loyalty I'd shown her during those early months had been weaponized against me with surgical precision, and every day brought new evidence that my mentor had become my executioner. I'd lie awake at night, replaying conversations, trying to figure out how someone I'd helped could become so calculating in their cruelty. But the answer was always the same. Ambition makes monsters out of people we thought we knew. The isolation that came with being the office joke was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Hailey's campaign, because it forced me to question not just my professional value, but my fundamental worth as a human being who deserved basic respect and dignity. When your colleagues start treating you like a punchline rather than a person, when your insights are dismissed before you finish speaking, when your presence becomes a source of entertainment rather than contribution, you begin to internalize those messages and wonder if maybe everyone else can see something about you that you've been blind to all along. The confidence I'd built over decades of successful projects and satisfied clients started to erode under the constant barrage of subtle insults and public dismissals, and I found myself second-guessing every comment, every suggestion, every attempt to participate in workplace discussions that had once felt natural and effortless. There was a meeting where she crossed the line, and that day I went home with a knot in my chest. Nobody noticed, or they pretended not to notice. The quarterly review meeting on that grey Thursday morning in November was supposed to be a routine discussion about department performance and strategic planning for the upcoming year. I'd prepared my usual thorough analysis of our client retention rates, project completion timelines, and recommendations for improving workflow efficiency based on patterns I'd observed over my years of experience with the company. The conference room was packed with department heads, senior managers, and team leaders, creating an atmosphere of professional importance that should have been conducive to serious business discussion rather than the character assassination that was about to unfold. When I began presenting my findings about client satisfaction trends, I felt confident in my data and optimistic about contributing meaningfully to our strategic direction, completely unprepared for the psychological ambush that Hailey had apparently been planning for weeks. Halfway through my presentation about how our long-term client relationships had evolved over the past decade, Hailey raised her hand with exaggerated politeness and said, "This is all really fascinating historical context, Rebecca, but I think we need to focus on innovation rather than preservation." The room fell silent as she continued with calculated precision. "I mean, Rebecca is basically our living museum at this point, which is sweet, but maybe we should hear from someone who understands where the industry is actually heading instead of where it's been." The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable designed to diminish my credibility, while positioning herself as the forward-thinking visionary that the company desperately needed. The betrayal was complete and public, delivered with the kind of professional veneer that made it difficult to challenge without seeming defensive or unstable, and I felt something fundamental break inside my chest. The laughter that followed wasn't the nervous, uncomfortable chuckling I'd grown accustomed to during Hailey's previous attacks, but genuine amusement from people who apparently found my public humiliation genuinely entertaining. Dylan, our department manager, tried to redirect the conversation by clearing his throat and saying, "Well, let's hear all perspectives." But the damage was already done, and everyone in the room understood that my contributions had been officially categorized as irrelevant. Nostalgia rather than valuable insight. I looked around the table, searching desperately for even one sympathetic face, one person who might recognize the cruelty of what had just happened, but found only averted gazes and suppressed smiles that suggested my colleagues had been waiting for this moment, anticipating my downfall with the same enthusiasm that spectators bring to watching a public execution. The phrase that became permanently burned into my memory was delivered with such casual cruelty that it took several seconds for the full impact to register in my consciousness. "She's our museum piece," Hailey said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Sweet, but not exactly cutting edge, you know? The reduction of my entire professional identity to a quaint artifact was so devastating that I actually felt dizzy, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room and replaced with something toxic that made it difficult to breathe normally. 23 years of dedication, countless successful projects, relationships with clients who trusted my judgment and expertise, all of it dismissed as museum-worthy relics by someone who'd been in the company for barely 18 months and had learned everything she knew from sitting at my kitchen table during those mentoring sessions that now felt like acts of professional suicide. My response was pathetic and weak, exactly what Hailey had probably been hoping for when she launched her perfectly timed attack in front of the largest possible audience. I mumbled something about needing to take a phone call and gathered, my papers with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely grip the edges of the documents I'd spent hours preparing. The excuse was transparent and desperate, but I couldn't trust myself to remain in that room without either crying or saying something that would make the situation even worse for my already destroyed reputation. As I walked toward the door, I heard Hailey smoothly transition into her own presentation about innovative approaches to client engagement in the digital age, using concepts and strategies that sounded suspiciously similar to ideas we discussed during our private conversations months earlier, now repackaged as her original thinking and delivered to an audience that was clearly more receptive to hearing them from someone who wasn't a museum piece. The bathroom stall became my refuge for the next 20 minutes as I sat on the toilet seat cover and cried with the kind of desperate, silent sobs that come from having your entire sense of professional worth systematically destroyed by someone you trusted and nurtured. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like mechanical insects, and I could hear the muffled sounds of normal office activity continuing beyond the bathroom door, as if the world hadn't just witnessed my complete professional humiliation and found it mildly amusing rather than deeply disturbing. The betrayal felt so complete, so calculated, that I began to wonder if Hailey had been planning this destruction from the very beginning. If every moment of apparent gratitude and every expression of appreciation had been part of an elaborate long-term strategy to position herself as my replacement by systematically undermining my credibility and value to the organization. When I finally returned to my desk 45 minutes later, the meeting had ended and normal office bustle had resumed. But I felt like I was moving through a parallel universe, where everyone could see the scarlet letter of professional failure that was now permanently attached to my forehead. My computer screen looked the same. My coffee mug sat in its usual spot. My family photos smiled at me from their frames. But everything felt different, contaminated by the knowledge that I'd been publicly categorized as dead weight by someone who owed her entire career trajectory to my guidance and support. The quiet conversations that stopped when I approached cubicles, the sideways glances that followed me to the copy machine, the sudden silence that fell over the break room when I entered, all of it confirmed that my humiliation had become the day's entertainment, and that my professional reputation had been effectively destroyed in less than 5 minutes of expertly delivered character assassination. I thought about calling her for a talk. I thought maybe she didn't realize the impact of her jokes. But I never had the courage. She didn't give me space. The weekend after the quarterly review disaster, I spent hours rehearsing conversations that would never happen, standing in my kitchen and practicing different approaches to addressing what had become an unbearable situation at work. I'd start with reasonable explanations about how her comments were affecting team morale, then shift to personal appeals about our shared history and the mentorship I'd provided, and finally resort to direct confrontations about workplace respect and professional boundaries. Each imaginary conversation ended differently, sometimes with tearful apologies and renewed friendship, sometimes with hostile defensiveness and deeper conflict, but all of them shared the common fantasy that Hailey might actually care enough about my feelings to engage in honest dialogue about her systematic campaign of professional destruction. The delusion that I could somehow reach the person I thought I'd known, the grateful newcomer who'd once valued my guidance, kept me awake until 3 a.m, crafting speeches that would never be delivered to someone who no longer existed. Monday morning brought a brief moment of hope when I saw Hailey arriving at the same time I did, both of us walking through the parking lot toward the building entrance with only 20 feet between us. I quickened my pace slightly, thinking this might be the perfect opportunity for a private conversation before the workday officially began. But when I called out, "Hailey, wait up," she glanced back with what looked like genuine irritation and said, "Oh, hey Rebecca, I'm running super late for a client call. Can we catch up later?" The dismissal was so smooth and practiced that I realized she'd probably been avoiding one-on-one interactions for weeks, always having somewhere urgent to be. Whenever I tried to engage her in anything beyond surface-level pleasantries, the later she mentioned never materialized, of course, because there would always be another meeting, another deadline, Another perfectly legitimate excuse to avoid the uncomfortable conversation we both knew was hanging between us like a storm cloud. The pattern of avoidance became so obvious that I started to wonder if Hailey had developed some kind of sixth sense for detecting when I might try to address our deteriorating relationship. During coffee breaks, she'd suddenly remember urgent emails that needed immediate attention whenever I approached her table. In the hallway, she'd duck into conference rooms or bathrooms with impressive timing that suggested she'd been monitoring my movements and planning escape routes accordingly. Even during team meetings, she'd position herself strategically so that natural conversation flow would never direct attention toward our personal dynamic, always ready with business-focused comments that would steer discussion away from anything that might create an opportunity for private dialogue. The sophistication of her avoidance tactics was almost admirable. If it hadn't been so personally devastating to realize that someone I'd invested so much time and energy in now considered me a problem to be managed rather than a person deserving of basic respect. What hurt most about her evasive behavior wasn't just the rejection of potential reconciliation, but the way she'd begun talking about me, as if I were abstract concept rather than a flesh and blood colleague sitting 30 feet away from her desk. During lunch conversations that I could overhear from my cubicle, she'd discuss generational resistance to change and the challenge of working with people who are set in their ways, in tones that suggested she was analyzing a fascinating anthropological phenomenon rather than describing someone she interacted with daily. The clinical detachment in her voice when she referenced older employees who struggle with adaptation was somehow more insulting than outright hostility would have been, because it reduced me to a case study in workplace dysfunction rather than acknowledging me as a human being with feelings that could be hurt by such casual dehumanization. The few times I managed to corner her for what I hoped might evolve into meaningful conversation, she'd deploy an arsenal of deflection techniques that were so polished they seemed rehearsed. She'd start with concerned expressions and comments about how busy everything has been lately, transition into vague acknowledgments that workplace dynamics can be challenging for everyone, and finish with promises to definitely find time to chat soon, that we both knew were complete fabrications. Her ability to acknowledge the existence of tension without accepting any responsibility for creating it was masterful, like watching a politician field difficult questions with responses that sounded substantive but contained absolutely no real content or commitment to change. The conversations left me feeling more frustrated and isolated than if she'd simply told me to go to hell, because at least honest hostility would have been something I could respond to directly. By the end of that month, I'd given up on the fantasy of meaningful dialogue and accepted that the person I'd tried to help had either never existed or had been completely consumed by ambition and strategic thinking that left no room for basic human decency. The Hailey who used to seek my advice and express genuine gratitude had been replaced by someone who viewed me as an obstacle to be removed, rather than a colleague to be respected. And no amount of reasonable conversation was going to bridge the gap between those two versions of the same person. The loyalty I'd shown her during those early months had been forgotten as completely as if it had never happened, erased by the kind of selective memory that allows people to rewrite their own history in ways that serve their current needs, rather than acknowledge uncomfortable truths about how they'd achieved their success. The silence that had settled between us felt heavier than outright conflict, because it represented the death of something I'd thought was genuine, the complete betrayal of trust that I'd extended freely and had repaid with calculated cruelty. Every day brought new evidence that she was discussing my performance, my attitude, my value to the organization with people who had the power to influence my career trajectory, while simultaneously avoiding any direct conversation with me about her concerns or expectations. The professional assassination was happening behind closed doors, in meetings I wasn't invited to, through whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to defend myself against accusations I wasn't allowed to hear or address directly. The frustration of being systematically destroyed by someone who refused to engage with me openly was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire situation. because it denied me even the dignity of knowing exactly what I was being accused of, or having the accused of. Opportunity to present my side of whatever story she was telling about my professional inadequacies. The manager called me into his office. He said it was a delicate moment, that they needed to refresh the team, and that I could think about a transition with dignity. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in December, just after lunch, when Dylan's assistant approached my desk with that carefully neutral expression that administrative staff perfect for delivering uncomfortable messages. "Rebecca, Mr. Thompson would like to see you in his office when you have a moment," she said. And we both knew that when you have a moment was corporate speak for immediately, because this can't wait and probably won't be pleasant. The walk down the hallway felt like a death march, past cubicles where my colleagues suddenly became very interested in their computer screens, avoiding eye contact that might suggest they knew what was coming or had participated in whatever decision was about to be delivered behind Dylan's closed door. My 23 years with the company had taught me to read the subtle signals of organizational change, and everything about this unexpected meeting screamed termination disguised as voluntary departure. Dylan's office smelled like coffee and nervous energy when I stepped inside, and he gestured toward the chair across from his desk with the kind of forced casualness that people use when they're about to deliver life-altering news, while pretending it's a routine conversation. The stack of papers on his desk was positioned too perfectly, like props arranged for a performance, and his opening comments about appreciating my years of service and recognizing the valuable contributions I'd made had the rehearsed quality of someone who'd practiced this speech multiple times in front of his bathroom mirror. He talked around the actual purpose of our meeting for nearly 10 minutes, building up to the inevitable conclusion with corporate euphemisms about organizational restructuring and strategic realignment that were designed to make my forced departure sound like a natural evolution rather than a calculated execution. When he finally got to the point, the language was so sanitized and politically correct that it took several sentences for me to understand that I was being fired, though they'd never used such a crude word for what they preferred to call a voluntary transition opportunity. He explained that the company was implementing a generational refreshment initiative designed to bring innovative thinking and fresh perspectives to our client service approach, and that they were offering enhanced severance packages to employees who might be interested in exploring new opportunities outside the organization. The entire presentation was masterfully crafted to avoid any language that might suggest age discrimination, while making it crystal clear that my demographic profile had been identified as incompatible with their vision for the future, and that my choices were limited to accepting their generous offer, or waiting for them to find other reasons to terminate my employment. The most insulting aspect of the entire conversation was how Dylan framed my forced departure as some kind of gift, a generous opportunity for me to pursue new adventures and enjoy the flexibility that comes with life experience. He talked about the severance package like it was a retirement bonus I'd earned through years of faithful service, rather than hush money designed to prevent me from filing age discrimination lawsuits that might be embarrassing for the company's public image. The suggestion that I should be grateful for the chance to leave gracefully was delivered with such sincere conviction that I almost wondered if he actually believed his own corporate propaganda, or if he was simply a skilled enough actor to sell the company line with apparent authenticity. The condescension was breathtaking. The implication that a woman in her 50s should be thrilled to have her career terminated because it freed her up for gardening and grandchildren and other stereotypical activities that empty nest women supposedly pine for. What made the conversation particularly surreal was Dylan's repeated emphasis on maintaining dignity throughout the transition process, as if dignity was something the company was generously providing rather than something they'd systematically stripped away through months of tolerance for Hailey's public humiliation campaign. He assured me that they wanted to handle my departure with the respect and professionalism that reflects your years of service, apparently oblivious to the irony of offering respect at the moment they were discarding me like outdated office equipment. The dignity he kept referencing was really about protecting the company's reputation and ensuring that my departure looked voluntary rather than discriminatory, maintaining the fiction that I was choosing to leave rather than being pushed out by someone young enough to be my daughter who'd convinced management that my experience was a liability rather than an asset. The timeline for my decision was presented as generous, that the underlying message was clear that this was an offer I couldn't refuse without facing consequences that would be far worse than accepting their terms. Dylan gave me a week to consider the opportunity and discuss it with my family, that the subtext was obvious that declining their voluntary departure package would result in performance reviews, documented inadequacies, and eventual termination for cause that would leave me with nothing, that damaged references and a reputation for being difficult to work with. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. It was a carefully orchestrated manipulation designed to make me complicit in my own professional execution, while protecting the company from any legal liability that might result from more direct forms of age discrimination. When I walked out of Dylan's office 20 minutes later, carrying a folder full of severance documents and transition timelines, I felt like I was holding my own obituary, neatly typed and legally reviewed by people who'd decided that my professional life had reached its natural conclusion. The hallway seemed longer than usual, and I was acutely aware of the sounds of normal office activity continuing around me. Phones ringing and keyboards clicking and conversations flowing as if the world hadn't just shifted fundamentally beneath my feet. The folder in my hands contained the mathematical calculation of my professional worth, reduced to severance payments and benefits continuation that would supposedly compensate for the loss of identity, purpose, and financial security that had defined my adult life for more than 2 decades. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table reading through the legal documents that would formalize my disappearance from a company where I'd invested the best years of my career. And I couldn't help but wonder if Hailey had been in Dylan's office earlier that day, discussing the success of her campaign and planning how she'd transition into the expanded role that my departure would create for her advancing career. I gave myself open doors. I was an example, and then I became a joke. Today I carry scars and a firm decision. Never again will I dim my light to brighten others. The final week at the office was a masterclass in corporate indifference disguised as professional courtesy, with colleagues who'd worked alongside me for years, suddenly treating me like a contagious disease that might infect them with whatever career-ending condition had led to my voluntary departure. The few people who bothered to acknowledge my leaving did so with the kind of awkward small talk that people use at funerals, offering generic well wishes about new adventures and exciting opportunities that we all knew were euphemisms for unemployment and forced retirement at an age when starting over feels impossible rather than exciting. Hailey, predictably, was conspicuously absent during my final days, conveniently scheduled for client visits and off-site meetings that kept her away from any potential awkwardness that might result from being in the same room with the woman whose career she'd systematically destroyed. The cowardice was almost impressive in its completeness. The way she managed to avoid any final confrontation or moment of reckoning that might have forced her to acknowledge what she'd done. What I wanted to say to her, if I'd ever gotten the chance for one last honest conversation, was something that had been building in my chest for months, like pressure in a steam kettle. "You're sitting exactly where I put you," I would have told her, looking directly into those calculating eyes that had once seemed so grateful and eager to learn. Every client relationship you've inherited, every process you understand, every piece of institutional knowledge that makes you valuable to this company, all of it came from me sitting patiently in conference rooms and coffee shops, teaching you things that took me years to figure out through trial and error and professional mistakes that you never had to make because I was there to guide you around them. The fantasy conversation always ended with her looking ashamed and apologetic, finally understanding the magnitude of her betrayal. But I knew that even if I'd gotten the opportunity to speak those words, she would have found a way to deflect responsibility and reframe my mentorship as something she'd earned rather than something I'd given freely. The nights during that final week were spent in brutal self-examination, lying awake replaying every interaction, every moment of generosity, every piece of advice I'd offered with genuine intention to help someone I thought deserved support and guidance. I dissected my own motivations with surgical precision, wondering if my willingness to mentor had been naive idealism, desperate loneliness, or simple professional duty that I'd elevated to something more meaningful than it actually was. The pattern was clear in retrospect: how I'd consistently prioritized other people's success over my own advancement, how I'd shared credit and deflected praise and stepped aside to let others shine, believing that good intentions and hard work would eventually be recognized and rewarded. The realization that my generosity had been weaponized against me was devastating, but it also carried a strange sense of liberation, like finally understanding the rules of a game I'd been playing wrong for decades. What I wished for my former colleagues, the ones who'd watched my public humiliation with amusement rather than outrage, was a moment of clarity that would help them recognize the warning signs before they found themselves in similar situations. The ageist jokes that they'd laughed at weren't harmless fun. They were test runs for a systematic campaign of professional destruction that could easily be redirected toward any of them, once they became inconvenient obstacles to someone else's ambition. The silence that had greeted my repeated humiliations wasn't neutral professionalism. It was complicity in workplace bullying that created an environment where experience was treated as a liability and loyalty was seen as weakness to be exploited. I wanted them to understand that their laughter had consequences, that their refusal to defend basic human dignity had made them participants in something ugly and destructive that would eventually come for them too. Because bullies never stop with just one target. The most important lesson I'd learned through this devastating experience was that professional relationships are often transactional arrangements disguised as personal connections, and that the gratitude people express during their climb up the corporate ladder tends to evaporate once they've reached positions where your help is no longer necessary. The mistake I'd made wasn't in being generous with my time and knowledge. It was in expecting that generosity to be remembered and valued by people who'd learned to view everything through the lens of strategic advantage rather than human decency. The trust I'd extended so freely had been a gift that was received, used, and discarded without ceremony or acknowledgement, and my failure to protect myself from that exploitation was a lesson I'd carry forward into whatever came next in my professional life. Today, working in a smaller firm where my experience is actually valued and my contributions are acknowledged with genuine appreciation, I still hear Hailey's laughter echoing in my head during quiet moments, a reminder of how quickly professional relationships can turn predatory when ambition overrides basic humanity. The scars from that experience haven't faded completely. They've become part of my decision-making process, informing how I evaluate new colleagues and how much of myself I'm willing to invest in helping others succeed. I'm more cautious now about sharing institutional knowledge, more protective of my own ideas and insights, more aware of the ways that generosity can be interpreted as weakness by people who view the workplace as a battlefield rather than a collaborative environment where mutual support leads to collective success. The woman who walks into client meetings now carries herself differently than the Rebecca who used to stay late helping newcomers learn the ropes. Not because I've become cynical or cruel, but because I've learned to value my own contributions enough to protect them from people who might use my guidance as ammunition against me. When younger colleagues ask for advice, I offer it judiciously, with clear boundaries and realistic expectations about reciprocity and recognition that protect both of us from the kind of toxic dynamic that destroyed my relationship with Hailey. The loyalty I give now is earned rather than freely offered, and the trust I extend comes with the understanding that professional relationships are fragile constructs that can be shattered by ambition, insecurity, or simple human selfishness that views other people's success as threats rather than inspirations. Some might call this approach defensive or guarded, but I call it survival. The hard-won wisdom that comes from learning too late that not everyone who asks for help deserves it, and not everyone who receives it will remember where it came from when it's time to acknowledge the sources of their success. If this story resonated with you, If it helped you recognize patterns in your own workplace relationships, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because understanding workplace betrayal is just the beginning, we need to talk about how to rebuild your confidence, protect your reputation, and create professional relationships that actually serve your growth rather than undermining it. Don't let someone else write the ending to your career story, the way Hailey tried to write mine.